Hi, my name is Angelo Lopez. I'm a Filipino American editorial cartoonist who's based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I have the honor and the privilege today to speak to a distinguished lawyer, Ruth Silver Taube. Ruth has worked on wage theft issues, um, human trafficking issues, and other issues facing the Filipino American community, as well as other minority communities in the Southern Bay Area. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you. It's my honor and privilege to be talking with you. I'm a great fan of yours. Your cartoons are very timely, and you're a great advocate for justice.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I admire you as well and stuff. And that's one of the reasons I want to talk to you today and stuff. So yeah, I guess to start off, when I first started doing editorial cartoons, I went to several protests and political rallies, and that's where I met you. Um, and when I listened to you, and I listened to other Filipino American activists who work with you, um, I learned a lot about issues facing the local Filipino American community, and that was very helpful when in me doing my cartoons. I want to thank you for that. Um, and also, I'm curious. I want to know for you, what is the importance of protest and political rallies?
Well, my parents took me to protests and political rallies when I was a child. I grew up in Canada, in Toronto, and we often protested issues that were Canadian, but often I was at the US Embassy, or I'm not sure if it was an embassy or a consulate, but in Toronto, and protesting injustices in the United States because we shared a border. And I always felt it was important because the media tends to cover protests, but also there's solidarity, and you listen to people speak about their issues and can lift it up. And often protests apply pressure to legislators as well and get the community engaged, because these issues are very important, but they often are below the radar. For example, with the Wage Theft Coalition, we do direct actions. We did a lot more of them before COVID, but I know you were there and you memorialized them in excellent videos, and I think they got exposure. And I believe that those issues where we actually had workers speak, particularly in the Filipino community, care home workers, but also fast food workers, janitorial workers, and day laborers, speak about the working conditions. I think it helped us get legislation, wage theft legislation, passed. It also informed people about the dangers of human trafficking and the prevalence of exploitation in the workplace.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, I'm curious. Who were your social justice heroes and heroines? And you mentioned your parents and stuff. Were they heroes of yours?
My parents were. They were both very committed to social justice and talked to me about social justice issues. I really admired Nelson Mandela, and actually I taught in West Africa and Sierra Leone. I wanted to go to Southern Africa, but they didn't have any openings at the university there. So I taught in Sierra Leone because I really wanted to go there. I was very inspired by a lot of the movements in Africa, but also in the US, Mother Jones, who fought for the end of child labor. Frances Perkins, who she was the first woman at the heading up the Department of Labor. She fought for unemployment. She got an unemployment insurance and Social Security. And of course, Dolores Huerta as well, who fought for the farm workers. So there were Paul Robeson, people that stood up against injustice, against racism, and against exploitation.
Were they inspirations for you moving towards working for social justice?
Yes, yes, they were. I feel like it's important to have heroes and sheroes that that inspire you and empower you to speak up. But my heroes now are the workers. And they're so courageous. There's so much retaliation. They work under very difficult conditions. And as you know, I was a machinist, and I know what it's like to work in a factory situation, and all of the indignities and exploitation. And so the workers that speak up are really inspiring. We just had Workers' Memorial Day, and we had workers speak up about health and safety issues. And it just really touched my heart.
Yeah. Well, since you talked about machinist, I know you were president of Machinist Local 547, and
Mhm.
you were field representative of SEIU Local 535, right? Me in the 1990s, when I was working part-time in the Sunnyvale Public Library, I was secretary of my local SEI unit from 1998 to 2000. And that experience has had a lasting influence in how I see worker issues, right?
And that has for me, my dad was he did some mine worker organizing, and I have always felt that unions can really alleviate a lot of misery and lift up workers. Because right now our laws aren't that good for workers. You can be fired at will in every state except for Montana for any reason or no reason except for discrimination because you're in a protected class or retaliation. But in a union, you can only be fired for just cause.
Yeah.
You could be fired in a non-union because they don't like the color of your shirt or
Oh,
because want to hide,
I didn't know, I didn't know it was that
or
bad.
yeah, as long as it isn't because of your race, religion, national origin, age over 40, gender, or disability, or because you spoke out against something that violates state or federal law. But if I didn't like that green color shirt, or if I wanted to hire my nephew, I could do it with impunity. And also promotion could be favoritism in non-union. In union, it's in order of senior qualified. Layoffs are senior qualified. And if you have a problem, there's a grievance and arbitration process where you don't have any due process rights at all if it's non-union. But there's been so much propaganda. There's like a whole industry that's vilifying unions. And so people have absorb that and don't realize that we probably wouldn't have wage theft if we had unions, because the union could file a grievance. We wouldn't need these agencies because unions would be able to handle it. We might need them, for some situations, but generally, no. It's maybe for education and outreach about people's rights. But
Yeah.
I really feel that unions are important. And there's good ones and bad ones, but if there's a union that isn't doing its job, it's because the union is us. And the union is the people. It's kind of like politics. If you don't vote and you don't participate in the process, there is a chance that you'll get bad leaders, and it's the same with the union. So the
Yeah.
important thing is to participate, to get involved, and then unions are really important.
Yeah, I know with me, and during the 90s when I was in SEIU, we negotiated, I was part of the negotiations for SEIU and the city, but it was a more friendly negotiations because during that time there was a tech boom.
Mm.
And the city was having a difficult time getting enough applicants to fill in positions. So at that time, they were a lot more friendly towards the what the SEIU was wanting to give, what was asking for. But in 2008, it was a totally different negotiation, because that's when the crash came and
Okay.
stuff, and it was a lot more hostile bargaining. I wasn't a part of that bargaining team, but I talked to one person who was a part of it, and I think field representatives are very important in
Mhm.
negotiations, because we don't have the negotiating team. We don't have experience because we're basically trained in our job. The
Mhm.
field representative has experience that helps us, like if we have a question and stuff. Their advice is very helpful. A good field rep is very important and stuff. And you were field rep, right? Was that
Yeah,
part of
I
what
was
you
a
did?
senior field rep and I did the negotiations, the contract negotiations for SEIU, as well as handling grievances. And it was all the way from here to King City. So I had a
Oh,
I represented a lot, but also unions raise living standards. The wages are decent and
yeah.
there's definite benefits. And we wouldn't have all of these things like the weekend and the 40-hour week if it weren't for unions. So it's really, really important. And particularly in the trades, it really is sort of life-changing if you're in a union versus if you're working non-union. And then health and safety is something that's important because you have a health and safety committee and you have the union that has your back if things aren't safe. Uh,
Yeah.
and when I was a machinist, I worked in a factory where they had me work with something that was strange. And I asked what it was, and they wouldn't tell me. And finally, they told me it was asbestos. And I called OSHA, and they shut it down. They shut down that part, and made them get rid of the asbestos. And they knew that I was the one who called, and yet I didn't get fired because I had a union. And the
Yeah.
union was very upset because they were hiding this in a little room and no one really knew about it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I know that at least for workers and stuff, things I visibly saw things improve for the part-timers when we had a union, and for the full-timers now, we almost went on strike in I think 2018, 2007, but
Uh-huh.
at the last minute, we had a compromise. But since then, the full-timers now are in a union, not SEIU, but a different union.
Well, I just had a recent experience because, as you know, I'm an adjunct at Santa Clara University Law School. I teach a workers' rights class, really employment law, and then I also supervise a clinic, a workers' rights clinic. And the adjuncts that work in the other schools, I teach, but that's their full-time job. And there's about almost at least 450, 500 of them. And they organized a union. I was on the organizing committee. The law school didn't end up being included, but the rest of them did. And SEIU 10-1 was just magnificent. I mean, they offered so much advice, support, but they listened to the faculty. They let the faculty drive the effort. They knew the faculty had expertise and knew what to talk about, what to do, what actions to do. And they really listened, but they had resources. They had meetings. They went to people's houses with the faculty, and we won 73%. So it was really a
Oh,
very
wow.
successful campaign for the adjuncts, and now they're bargaining for their first contract. And they had one of the union busters. They had Littler Mendelson that says, the Santa Clara University did, that says on their website they specialize in union avoidance, but they couldn't avoid this one.
Congratulations. I don't have experience with union busting, so I don't know.
Well, they usually hire one of those union avoidance firms to try to talk people out of being in the union. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not, but usually like Starbucks, Amazon, and teachers, they've tried everything else,
Yeah.
and so they're at a point where they know they need a union.
Yeah. Do you guys have agency shop there, or is that not a issue now? When in the 90s and early 2000s, there was an issue with some of the workers with agency shop.
Well,
That's where like if you're not in a union, you still have to pay a little bit since the law says that the union, whatever they negotiate, has to cover non-union and union members and stuff.
yeah, well, yeah, that's still there, too, that if, yeah, you have to pay a certain amount. And often I think of those people that don't pay dues as free riders because they're benefiting from the union, but they're not in the union. But yeah,
Yeah.
they have to pay a certain amount, but
Yeah, because
yeah.
I'm wondering if that Supreme Court ruling had an
Yeah,
effect on
it
that.
did. It had a big effect on public sector unions. Yeah, it had a big effect.
Oh, okay. Well, I know that you are a very distinguished lawyer and stuff, and you've worked for the United States Department of Justice. You've worked
Oh,
for
I worked through Key Bridge. I was a mediator, and they contracted with the
oh,
Department of Justice to do mediations on disability issues. So I did that, and then I did work at the EOC and as well. And I also had my own firm, and I teach, and I also supervise the Santa Clara County Office of Labor Standards Enforcement Legal Advice Line. And we have lawyers on there. Most are my former law students that are now lawyers, or they're volunteer attorneys at the clinic, and they speak English, Spanish, Visayan, Tagalog, Mandarin, and Vietnamese. And I was very excited when the RFP came out because I thought, we need a legal advice line. And I have the people for you to
oh, okay.
do that, because I think people feel really much more comfortable in their own language. Because even with the Filipino workers, the woman who speaks both Tagalog and Visayan said that when someone is speaking Visayan and she then, starts speaking, they feel very relaxed and comfortable,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that they really understand. So I think that really makes a difference.
yeah. My
So,
dad's
and
that
we
way.
can reach more people too, but I'm on the English line and I get the most calls. Well, the Spanish line actually gets quite a few calls too, but I tend to get the most. But it's very rewarding, and workers call, and they have somewhere to go. Some actually, they have employers call too, and I didn't know what that would be like, but the ones that call are really good. I guess if you'd call an advice line and you want to know how to do things right, you're going to be good. So it's
Yeah.
nice because I see the bad ones usually, so it kind of restores my faith that there's some good ones out there too.
No, you mentioned RFP. What is that?
It's the request. It's the bid. That the county Office of Labor Standards in Enforcement puts out a request for a proposal. So we are on contract. It's basically in order to get a contract. So we're on contract with the county for the advice line, and also we're part of the Fair Workplace Collaborative. And POWIS is in it, VAR, Vietnamese American Roundtable, Mountain View Day Worker Center, Working Partnerships, and I'm in it with a couple of other attorneys through Step Forward Foundation, because going through the university, it's just a lot of red tape. So Step Forward, Mimi Nguyen is the executive director of Step Forward, and they do a lot of immigration and family law work, but they're a 501c3 nonprofit.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now, what got you interested in becoming a lawyer? And I guess, with that, why is the law important to you?
Well, my parents were immigrants and didn't have a lot of education. My mother started taking courses, and I really didn't know a lot of lawyers at all But I did care about social justice. I actually believe the stereotypes about lawyers, and never really wanted to be one because of those stereotypes, because I didn't want to be part of a system that causes, misery to people. And I
What
didn't
made
want
you
to
change your mind?
profit.
Yeah, what
Well,
made you change your
what
mind?
made me change my mind was working for the union, because when I was at SEIU, we had a union side law firm with lawyers that had represented farm workers and the farm workers union, and that were, that went out to King City and, out to Soledad and Salinas, and when we had grievances, and that were really down to earth and really cared about social justice. And I thought, and I liked what they did, because they did the arbitrations. They did work that was more than I did. I would be at the contract negotiations, but what they did, I thought, was on a different level. And so I actually had a discrimination lawsuit as a woman, that they hired a man and I was more qualified. And I settled it for the amount of money that law school costs. So
Oh.
they said, what do you want? And I said, how much does law school cost? So I ended up going to law school. I actually, when I became a machinist, I was like a thesis away from a PhD in English, and I felt like I was in the ivory tower. And so I wanted to work, and I wanted to work for a union. And then when I worked for the union, I saw the kind of lawyer that I wanted to be. And so I decided to go to law school, and it was quite law school is quite an experience, but I ended up after that clerking for a federal judge. And then I worked with my husband and did employment. I always just wanted to do employment law. And then I went to the EOC, and then I came back. I didn't like commuting to San Francisco. So
Oh, okay, okay. And that's how you grew to love, you saw how law can work for social
I
justice.
saw it could. I wanted to be a movement lawyer. And I do like my protests. As you know, you see me there. And so I'm a legal observer for the National Lawyers Guild. I'm one of the coordinators for this
Oh,
space. So I do that. And I also do outreach and education. I'm kind of a training machine. I do lots of training for the domestic violence, like Community Solutions, the Y, sometimes Aki. And I also train all the bus drivers. I've been doing it for 8 years, actually transit operators on human trafficking, all the new employees, which is every couple of months. And I'm doing a training for Worker Power Academy. I train fast food workers. I'm always training for POWIs. And I also, there's another training I do that in conjunction with the Day Worker Center. So, and then I train youth too, because I feel like people need to know their rights. It empowers them. And I wish they taught it in high school. There's actually a bill right now to have a week. I don't know if that's enough, but to train high school students on their rights before they get their first job. I think that's so critical, because I didn't know my rights before I was a lawyer and
oh.
worked.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for doing that, because you are, in some ways you taught me and stuff, because if it wasn't for you, and it wasn't for some of the people you probably trained and stuff, it was helpful for me in my cartoons and stuff. So I thank you for that. And I'm guessing all of these other people thank you too, because when you get empowered and stuff, it makes for a better world.
But it's not just me. It's a collective effort. There's so many people out there that I work with that do such incredible work in the community, and also lawyers as well. And I'm really inspired by them. I'm in this statewide coalition, California Coalition for Worker Power, at the way as the Wage Theft Coalition, and they do so much advocacy. And I do a lot. I testified last week in Sacramento on 2 bills. One was well, 3 actually. One was joint employers for fast food, trying to make the corporate fast food companies responsible and liable. The other one was corporate transparency, because often we have shell corporations and can't tell who the beneficial owner, the one who made the money. And so we don't know how to go after it. And the third one, which was one that I actually thought of myself, which was the fact that the labor code, the retaliation provisions aren't really consistent. And we need to make it easier on the workers, because we can't really know what's in the employer's head when they terminate someone. They often don't tell them after, and this is terminate them after they spoke up about, their wage, overtime or health and safety. So this will have a rebuttable presumption. In other words, if it happened that you were fired within 90 days after the protected activity, then it's presumed that it was retaliation. Of course, the employer can then come back and produce evidence that there was a legitimate non-retaliatory reason, and then you have to prove that it was a pretext. But
so I guess it shifts the burden of proof.
It shifts the burden, yeah, at least the burden of production. And it already exists in the labor code. The warehouse workers bill, the fast food bill, it's in sick leave, and it's also in the immigration related retaliation. And then the other one is it's part of the same bill for whistleblowers. You can get up to $10,000, but it goes to the state. And we want it to go to the workers, and it's limited to LLCs and corporations, and we want to get rid of that limitation. And that's for all labor code violations, the rebuttable presumption, and the Equal Pay Act, the retaliation provisions. And equal pay in California covers not just gender, but race and ethnicity too. Okay. So, and there are some other really good bills too. I'm not involved in them, except that I am in this coalition for work and families about sick leave, because sick leave is a huge problem. In California, we only get 3 days of sick leave, and that's not enough. And this one is wanting 7 days of sick pay, because it's really critical. And I was reading that the NAACP was saying that it's a class and race issue, sick pay, because middle class people get as much sick pay. If you work for the county or you work for a big corporation, you can take off and get paid, whereas low wage workers, care home workers, fast food workers, janitors who aren't union, they don't get paid except for 3 days for a cold or something like that.
Yeah. And I guess did the pandemic put that issue in stark relief?
I think it did. It put it in stark relief. That's a really good way of putting it. I think what happened was there were always problems, but the pandemic exacerbated them and really shone a light on low-wage workers, and they were the essential workers. They had to come out there, and because there was illness, people looked at what the laws were, whereas I don't think they paid attention before.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering, you worked for the South. You did work. You are doing work now for the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking, as well as the South Bay Wage Theft Coalition. How has human trafficking and wage theft affected the Filipino American community?
It's Santa Clara County Wage Theft Coalition, South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. I'm the policy co-chair I'm policy co-chair of Cal Coalition for Worker Power, but for the human trafficking, I'm the co-chair of the Legal Service Providers, and it has really hit the Filipino community very hard. Recently, there was the Rainbow Bright case. It involved 90 workers, and they worked in care homes and child care centers, and there was a verdict in that case. We've had local people in San Jose that have been care home workers that have been victim of human trafficking. We had, who was Filipina. We had one who worked in another state in a hotel that was a victim of trafficking. And we also see fraud in foreign labor contracting, because there's labor contractors. We had a case where they brought a woman here who had a accounting background, and they put her in a care home to work. And so,
Well, I
and
didn't know
we,
that. I didn't know
yeah,
that.
we also see debt bondage cases where basically they say you have to keep working to work off a debt, which is a form of trafficking, because there's coercion there because you have to keep working. But yes, we see a lot of trafficking cases, and some of them are really exploitative, and people are getting paid almost nothing, money subtracted out for an immigration lawyer, who can't really do anything for the person. Lots of threats of deportation, or they'd call ICE or the police if they left. And I mean, in a few cases, there's rape, and it's horrible. There has to be force or fraud or coercion, and there's a lot of coercion in those cases. And there are undocumented workers in the Filipino community, and I think they're exploited the most.
Yeah, yeah. I know that among overseas Filipino workers in other countries, they're very vulnerable because the labor laws in those countries often don't cover migrant workers and stuff. And so that, they take their passport and stuff, and they,
And that happens here too, that they take their passport. Yes, I know it happens in other countries. We had a speaker who went to one of the countries in the Middle East and was exploited and trafficked, but it's really prevalent here. And they generally, the first thing they do is they take their passport, and they have no option but to stay, and then they're threatened, they're not paid, and they sleep on the floor and work basically 24 hours. Especially with care home workers, they're very vulnerable in terms of wage theft, period. But with trafficking, it's usually wage theft on a whole other level. They barely get paid anything. To me, it's just excessive greed that somebody wants to control someone and not pay them. And it's really criminal.
Yeah. Well, I remember one of the first times I met you was when you did a protest a couple years ago in front of a house that had caregivers.
Bayview. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
a 6-bed. That's exactly right. Yes, and you memorialized that as well in your wonderful video. But yes, that one was Bayview Care Home, and they tried to get one. There was wage theft. I think it was around something like $80,000. It was a man and his mother who worked there, and they went into bankruptcy, which was not just, they weren't eligible for bankruptcy. They went into bankruptcy to try to avoid it. And wage justice was able to get the money to the workers. But we had a big protest there. That was with the Filipino workers. We also have been to fast food like Arby's. I think you were
Yeah, I was there.
at that protest. We had a lot of people, and that one was retaliation, sexual harassment, and wage theft. And often those all go together, where you have different forms of exploitation. But the community has been wonderful. I mean, the unions, even the laborers brought out 50 people. There were people from the Day Worker Center, POWIs, from the union movement, working partnership. I mean, people really came out in solidarity with the workers, both at Bayview and at Arby's as well. And then we had Crazy Buffet. They
Oh, I heard
changed,
about that. Yeah.
that was huge. And we had, they changed the name of the company 21 times every time they had a judgment. I mean, it still
Oh,
said Crazy Buffet, but with the Secretary of State. And we ended up, the California Coalition for Worker Power, using that as one of the examples of why we needed a bill that if they do turn the company over to a family member or to, and basically continue the business, there'll still be liability. And the last owner there was a student at UCLA who clearly was not, the beneficial owner, didn't get any money from it. So that was something that I think helped propel legislation. And then we had actually one of the care home workers testified. She went to actually about 25 lobby visits because what happened to her was that she had gone to the Labor Commission, got some money. And so the employer then tried to fiddle with the overtime by giving her 3 hours off in the middle of the night. Of course, she had to keep working because the worker, they had dementia, they got up, she had to, so she was working. I mean, in the middle of the night, 3 hours, you can't rest. And
yeah.
so he tried to circumvent, but in the meantime, I don't know if he knew in the back of his mind that she was going to file another claim, but he gave the company over to one of the admin, the manager's admins over there. And so she testified why we need this bill for successor liability if it's just a subterfuge.
Oh,
And
okay.
it passed too. The
Yeah.
bill passed and was signed by the governor.
Yeah, I'm curious. This is just a question that popped into my head. Do you find that when victims of this sort of exploitation, when they become empowered, they become activists themselves?
I do. Particularly, I see it in POWIs that there's worker leaders that were victims and now don't want it to happen to anybody else and speak out and do outreach and education. And some of them are working with through the National Domestic Workers. I just went the other day to see the workers doing a presentation on health and safety. But they also speak. I mean, at the Workers' Memorial, we had a number of workers speaking, and every one of them talked about their situation. One guy had a workers' comp situation. Others were talking about COVID and the effect and what they saw. And it was very, I mean, they had to relive it. And so some of them were in tears, but they did speak up. They are worker leaders now. And because we have the Fair Workplace Collaborative, and we're also part of the it's COVID Worker Outreach Project and the
Oh,
unemployment outreach. The workers are doing outreach and talking to people in the care homes and talking to workers in restaurants and other workers. We also have now, it's called Retail Food Advisory Council, because the fast food workers had a bill, AB 257, that would set up a council or like a board that would have, because it's hard for them to unionize because they're just like care homes. It's hard to unionize when you've got these little separate structures. But this bill, it's got workers on it, it's got advocates, and it's got government as well, and employers, and they set standards for the industry. Actually, sadly, the Chamber of Commerce mobilized, and it's going to be on the ballot, so it's in abeyance. But as part of that bill, it authorizes local jurisdictions to set these up. So I wanted to get a jump on it. So I spoke to the OLSC and we set up this advisory council, and we're going to be doing a survey of restaurant workers. And, there's Jollibees too. So there are
Oh,
And there's also workers that are at Starbucks that are Filipino. So in terms of the Filipino connection. And so we're going to do a survey with Berkeley and then do a report. And they're going to do a report out of that. And hopefully then we can make some recommendations. And that's because the county has jurisdiction over all of the food service employers, because they give them the little green health permit. Otherwise, their jurisdiction is limited to unincorporated areas. But so that's why we're focusing on the food industry. They also have an excellent program, which we also advocated for, which is that if there's unpaid judgments in the food service, they have a list of all those unpaid judgments, and they give them 45 days to pay. And if they don't pay, then they lose their health permit. And it was kind of an uphill battle for a while to convince the local governments that wage theft was a public health issue. But to me, it's very clear, because if you don't get paid, you can't go to the doctor, you can't get food that's nutritious.
yeah.
And so it affects public health. And there were publications out of San Francisco on that, which helped us. And also, I think people thought wage theft was basically these little mom and pop, but we had a person from Stanford, Forrest, who crunched numbers and did Public Records Act requests and got all the data and the database from the Labor Commission, and could show that there's these huge, everybody does it. It's a business model. It's big businesses, it's small businesses. And so I think that kind of opened their eyes that it is really, it's, as I said, a business model. It's just what they do to make more profit off the backs of workers. And maybe if you're a middle-class person and, you lose some money, that's one thing. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck,
yeah.
and you have children and all that, how do they justify that? And then, collecting is so hard once you win, because the Labor Commission is drowning and the private lawyers take a big percentage, but they won't take it unless it's above a certain amount. And for workers, even a small amount of, a few thousand is not as small, but even that is huge to them.
Yeah. I don't know if this is a related question and stuff that I have for you, but when I go to city council meetings and stuff, sometimes I see you there a lot, and you're lobbying various cities in the South Bay to enact local city ordinances against wage theft. Is that why? Is it because why is that important and stuff? Is that part of your effort? Because it sounds like that's a state level thing, and yet you're trying to do things in the city level. If the state won't do it, are you thinking that maybe the city can? With city ordinances, you can.
That's right. It's not really a state level. It's true that, the statutes are, many of them are state statutes. However, if you look at the legislative history, there was a recognition by the legislature that local governments had a role to play too. So it's not preempted. It's not, there's certain things where the state occupies the field, but wage theft really isn't one of them. And because the Labor Commission is inundated with claims, and because the system is such that employers have impunity, we did a wage theft report. This was 10 years ago, but then we just did one now as well. And we advocated for local governments to use their power to create consequences for employers. So for example, local governments contract, and it's huge, billions of dollars even for some of them. And at least in the millions. And we wanted to make sure that businesses who contract with local governments disclose if they have unpaid wage theft. And second of all, they don't get those contracts, either unpaid or repeat violators. And we didn't have Public Works in there, and we just got that in a couple weeks ago. And then we also wanted to make sure that if they give business licenses to businesses, that they have to disclose and they don't get them. But some of these cities, and we went to San Jose, Sunnyvale, Mountain, we went to a number of cities, Milpitas, and a number of businesses don't have a business license, but they have a business tax, and you can't revoke a tax. So what we did was we went after a class of permits, like the police permits in San Jose. And then finally, we thought, what else? Well, they give building permits. So we were able to get disclosure and you don't get the permit. And what if you have a wage theft judgment while you're building? Well, there's some issues around revoking, in the middle of building, but we thought about the certificate of occupancy. So part of that ordinance is you can't occupy the building till you pay off that wage theft judgment. So those are the things that we've been working on and having to go city by city. So that's why I'm at city council a lot. But I also go for some other things too. Like, for example, the janitors there's a push, and we have it in one city now, that they have to hire union janitors to clean the city buildings and for the city contracts. And there's other things too, like after COVID, there was a recovery task force that I was on, and that we were advocating for more paid sick leave. And we also have a pilot project with the county, with the city of San Jose, like the county one, to do more outreach and education, because they enforce certain laws, like they enforce minimum wage laws for about 15 local jurisdictions. They also have opportunity to work, which is that a part-timer has to be offered a full-time job before someone else is hired. And they do a lot of work around prevailing wage in San Jose. They have a mini labor commission, Office of Equality Assurance, and they review certified payrolls to make sure that prevailing wages are being enforced. And they need more people, they need more money and resources. So I do show up. There's things I really care about too, not so much at the city level, but like single payer. I'm Canadian, and it's right. And so it really bothers me that, healthcare should be a right, and so many people are uninsured and underinsured. And I think COVID put it into stark relief, as you say.
Yeah. Well, I think that a lot of issues are interrelated.
They are.
They're kind of connected and stuff.
And it's funny because initially I was just doing wage theft and I did work at the EOC, so discrimination and all those issues. And then the immigration professor said to me, you should take a look at immigration. And then, I realized that these threats of deportation are extortion and witness tampering. So when I see those, I could send them over to the immigration lawyer for a U visa, and then also trafficking, labor trafficking. It's, there's labor exploitation, wage theft, and then labor trafficking. So I saw the relevance, but I also see the relevance, they're low wage workers that's where my interest is, in low wage workers from every community. And I remember people saying to me, because I said, we have the largest Vietnamese American population. We have a big Filipino population. And people said, oh, you have to know someone in those communities. Well, I thought that was kind of silly. So I just got on the phone and said, we'd love to do a clinic with you. And they said, when? Tomorrow, let's do it.
You tapped into a need that you didn't realize was there.
Well,
I
yeah,
guess.
and I learned about that need when I started the Wage Theft Coalition, because I went around to about 35 different organizations and they said, well, we don't do employment work. And I said, yeah, but the people that you speak to every day, they have issues with wage theft. And they said, yes. And so they saw how that was important. And when we do clinics in the community, we do it with an immigration lawyer, a housing. Housing is a big issue too for the workers, and health is a big issue for the workers too. But it isn't, I mean, it's a whole team of people. I really saw that last, on Friday at the Workers' Memorial. We have so many dedicated people in the South Bay, and
Yeah.
worker leaders and worker centers and unions that are really dedicated, very dedicated people. And because you can't do anything yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I learned that too in my brief time, relatively brief time, learning about issues and meeting activists. That reminds me, what you're saying sort of leads to a question that I had. You worked a lot with Powys.
Mhm.
Tell me, what is Powys and why is Powys important in the Filipino American community?
PAWIS is the Filipino Association of Workers and Immigrants. It started during around 9/11 with the airport screeners
Oh, okay.
issues. And it has always been focused on Filipino workers, and particularly in care homes, and zeroing in on workers that are in 6-bed facilities in particular, although there are workers now that are at some of the hospitals, and some of them work in the larger assisted living. It's kind of, people move, and unfortunately they have multiple jobs. So they'll
Yeah.
do one-on-one, they'll do 6-bed, and then maybe they'll work at a hospital too, because they are a CNA as well. And its focus really is education and outreach, but it's also it's almost like a family. It gives people in the community a fellowship. I mean, they do carry, they have these lovely events, they have Christmas, they had a Valentine's Day, they
Oh, okay.
celebrate birthdays, they karaoke, they dance, they do dancing. They're going to be doing a 1 billion rising for one of our events, and for the Filipino Independence Day, they're going to do some indigenous dances as well. And they're there for each other. They have each other's back. But they combine community support, but they also do education about the care home industry, exploitation, and they provide assistance to workers who want to pursue their rights as well. So I've seen it grow exponentially, and I've also see what a difference organizations like PAWIS, but also VAR for the Vietnamese community, the Day Workers Center, what they do for workers, and they give them confidence too. I've
Yeah.
seen the workers grow. They're now speaking out and telling their stories, and they make videos of these stories, and they speak at events, and it's nice that there's an organization like that in the community, and then people can speak their own language and
Yeah.
feel connected, because basically caregivers are sending money home to the Philippines. A
Yeah.
lot of them are not estranged, that's a bad word. They're separated. They're very not estranged from, but very separate. They're separated from their family. They're living apart is a better way of phrasing it. They're living apart from their families, which is very difficult.
Yeah. I
It's
did a
very,
cartoon on that. So,
yeah, it's very difficult, and they're willing to put up with, indignities at work as long as they can make money to send it back to their families, because things are very expensive there. There aren't very many jobs. And also just the conditions there are, are difficult. And as you show in your cartoons, it's really heartbreaking what's going on there. And so they're there for each other, which I think is very important. Having someone else who's going through the same thing, being able to talk about it and share your thoughts and insecurities is very important.
I admire Powys a lot and stuff. I've learned a lot from them and stuff. So, like what you were saying, I learned that from them and stuff. A lot about the issues involving caregivers.
OFWs too. I have, which is overseas Filipino workers. Yeah, I've learned a lot too. And I know during some of the, the meetings I've had with them, they've really educated me about conditions in the Philippines, because they have programs where they talk about the conditions there and the conditions of the workers, but also just talking to the workers. I learned so much, and it helps us with our bills too, because we were talking about a retaliation fund and, different things that'll help workers. We had focus groups with Powys, with other workers, day workers, fast food workers, but the Powys workers, I really learned a lot from too. And a lot of workers, just not being home and having to be here with just living in the US, having to take jobs which are, very different often from their training. Then specifically what undocumented workers are going through, and the separation from the families, and just generally how hard it is to work in the care homes, taking care. When I was at SEIU, I actually did represent in-home support. I represented county workers in Monterey County, but also here, Hope Rehab, San Andreas Regional, and in-home support service. So I did know something about it, but I really learned a lot more, and also a lot more about legislation that could help them, because they really gave very valuable insights into their circumstances and possible, I don't know about solutions, but at least legislation that would be helpful. And they're just wonderful people that really care about each other. It's really interesting because sometimes, there's friction and tensions, but every single time they work them out, and the people are there, and they ask them, what are you going through now? And they're very focused on the person as a person. They see the person. And I think, that was true in Sierra Leone too. I think there's something we've lost in the US, in terms of connection with people. And it's a very selfish society in general. We're very ego driven. And I think that's not true in the rest of the world.
Oh, yeah. I don't know them as well as you do. I'm more the pesky person who's always asking them questions, but I've never had karaoke with them and stuff. So probably good.
Well, if you go to one of the events, like when was I'm trying to think.
I went to their Christmas
Valentine's
one.
Day.
I went to a
The Christmas one. They do it public, it's in the big events, but a lot of dancing, a lot of dancing.
Yeah, that's a Filipino thing.
Yeah, well, it's great. It's good exercise, and it's just, it's a community, a way of people doing things together. So they invited me to dance at something, the Billion Rising. So I have the instructional video, and I'm trying to learn the steps. They invite not just me, but allies and community members and things. Like, they're very welcoming of people who who I don't know, who are willing to learn, and who are just really admire, at least I really admire them what they do. And as I said, there are parallel organizations in the community with different communities too. And to me, it's very important to have these type of organizations, and that I can refer clients to if they're interested, if they want some sort of support system as well.
Yeah.
And I know like Community Solutions has I think it's Survivor Empowerment group, and there's some Filipinos in that group too.
Yeah, I think that's part of like the feminist, isn't it, that the political always becomes personal and stuff, is that in order political activism, you build friendships, you build within a group of activists to help support you, because activism is always, you always go through your ups and downs, you go through your disappointments, you have your accomplishments, but part of it is building this social network of other activists that help support you.
I think that's right. I learned that too, because I remember when I first started in the union, when I was a machinist, I really didn't have much to do with people. And then I can't remember what film, but there was a woman standing outside a factory, and she said, "Oh, how's your kid? Oh, has your daughter had her baby?" It showed that they were, and then they followed her. She wanted to strike, and they followed her. And so that really opened my eyes that, that you need, I like people, and I don't want to intrude on them, but I think if you're there and people know you're non-judgmental, they are going to talk to you, and you're going to know them as people.
Yeah.
So I thought that's an important lesson. You don't force yourself on them, but people naturally gravitate. They try to figure out if you're safe, if you're a person that, and my parents didn't speak English at home, because I know they were saying to me, we can just speak Tagalog all day and you're fine. And I mean, that was my parents. I mean, they didn't want me to understand what they were saying. So
Like, that was similar to me. I was raised in America. My parents wanted me to be American, so they only spoke Tagalog to each other. So my siblings and I always had no idea what they were saying.
Yeah, well, I learned a little bit, but not much. So I was used to it. And same in Sierra Leone, it doesn't bother me. And that's why when I teach my students, these English only rules, with people saying that in the workplace, the employer is saying you can only speak English, which is illegal if it's on breaks or lunch or there's no business reason. And some of the reason they say is they think they're talking about you. And I said, who could have such a large ego to think that that's all they're doing is talking? But second of all, if you're not understanding, why is it bothering you?
Yeah.
So yeah, they come up with these reasons that don't make sense.
Oh, okay. Well, you I got my question. You worked for the Filipino Bar
Oh,
Association.
not for, with. I mean, I'm not in the. You said for. Yeah, I work with them. Yeah.
Oh, you work with them. Okay. You worked with the Filipino Bar Association, and you've also worked for the Vietnamese American, or with the Vietnamese American Bars Association of Northern California. What are the issues that you're working with those two groups?
Yeah, I'm not in either of them, but what I do is I do legal clinics in the community in partnership with them. Typically for FBank, the Filipino one, we're having one actually May 27th, but we have them regularly. So FBank comes and they bring lawyers, and then PAWIS comes and we get the law students, if there are some Filipino American law students, and so so they do intake, or if the lawyers are there, then the lawyers will give advice. And same with VABank, we were having the law center does the malpractice insurance, and we have a partnership with them. And we were, for years and years, the law center had an MOU with Vaubec. That's the one that I called where everyone goes, oh, you have to tight-knit community. And I just got on the phone and said, would you like to do a clinic? And okay, when can we start tomorrow? You know, we started a clinic, and we're having them regularly, weekly, and then COVID came, and they're going to start up now. There's the Vietnamese American Service Center. So yeah, so they're sort of a source of lawyers that have the linguistic and cultural abilities as well. So that's why we wanted to work with those bars.
Thank you for doing that. Thank you. I guess for my last question, I just want to know, what advice would you give for a Filipino American who wants to know more about issues in his or her community, and what are the issues? What are the pressing issues right now in the local Filipino American community?
Well, I mean, this is just my point of view, you know, as an outsider in the community, but from what I've seen, because I do regularly work with both attorneys that are in POWIs, but also with the workers. I think going to some of these events, they have regular Know Your Rights sessions. It used to be on Zoom during COVID, but now it's in person. They should definitely connect with POWIs. It's on social media, the Know Your Rights, and it's usually a couple of weeks before there's actually a legal clinic. That takes place every couple of months. Also, I think it would be good to connect and to become part of the community. There's opportunities to do outreach. They're part of the Fair Workplace Collaborative too, and education, and also just generally, you know, getting to talk to people that are worker leaders that have gone through the process, especially if there's any workplace issues they have. We also, you know nonprofit housing and immigration lawyers that can help as well. So I think that would probably be the best thing to do. And then, you know, they would have a community. In terms of the issues, I think the issues are the same as issues that affect other communities where you have immigrants, basically, and that's wage theft. There's housing issues that are really, really important. I think it the specifics of workers mainly being in healthcare, either in hospital, you know, nurses or health aides. And I think that there are specific problems. I did an article in Spotlight about how, unfortunately, even if there's unpaid judgments, there's not a mechanism, you know, to shut down or to put pressure on those care homes so they can do that with impunity. There's also, you know, other types of labor exploitation too, where there's retaliation if people speak up. I think you see that in other industries as well. And I think that there's, as I said, you know, people are vulnerable. There's labor trafficking, but there's also sort of a mindset too, where people feel almost like trauma bonding, you know, that there's a loyalty to the employer or to the person who got them the job, even though it's exploitative. And so I think you see those kind of issues in other communities as well. I did want to say that one thing that I think is really good is that the churches have really spoken up. I mean, stepped up, not spoken up, but stepped up, like Most Holy Family. There's other churches in the community where they've hosted events
Yeah.
And they've had religious services where they're actually talking about worker issues. They come to protests or to forums where issues are lifted up. And so I think that's good, because a lot of the Filipinos do go to church, and it's good to have a church that's open to talking about these issues, particularly in San Jose. I think we're really lucky to have those. So I think that's really, really important. And I think housing is a big issue.
Yeah.
The rents are very high, and it really affects people. But I also think that, people have ties to their own country.
Yeah.
Just like, I'm Canadian, I think about Canada, we have lots of problems there. And I think that people are worried about what's happening in the Philippines.
Yeah.
There's someone told me the other day that 4 of the people they knew who were killed, and that there's
Yeah.
a lot of fear for people that are doing work that's helping communities there, and just generally lawyers too are being killed. Lots of people are being killed, and I know someone who just came back who was in Powys, and it's very expensive, and it's very worrisome, I think, to people because of the fact that somehow the Marcoses are back in the
Yeah, that's
Philippines.
something I'm deeply worried about too and stuff. And that helps me. And one of the things I worry about is just both here and in the Philippines is the importance of history and learning the right history. Because from what I read, one of the reasons Marcos came back was that the Marcos family had a disinformation campaign on social media, and a younger generation of Filipinos never learned how bad martial law was. They never learned about crony capitalism, all of that stuff. And, you were talking about overseas Filipino workers that came out of the Marcos era, the dictatorship where the economy didn't have enough, couldn't produce enough jobs for people at home. And so the Filipinos had to go overseas. And the
Right.
remittance, and Marcos was hoping that the remittances would help the economy, but that meant many Filipinos would be overseas and wouldn't see their children for years and stuff.
Yeah, I understand that 6,000 Filipinos leave every single day. And I've also seen videos in the schools where they try to pigeonhole them into, hey, you should be in healthcare. This is to provide them with a vision of their future, which is basically working, in overseas in
Yeah.
the healthcare industry, or working in a call center. And I actually heard that with the call centers, some of these very bright kids, they lure them away from school by giving them a lot of money, and they interrupt their education, which really isn't very good. But where people are leaving their country, it's the brain drain, basically.
Yeah.
And this happens all over with in healthcare in Nigeria and other countries. But this is, as you said, Marco started it, but it's very robust, and
Yeah.
people are leaving and having to leave their families. And I know I've said to them, where people say they miss their family, I said, well, you're giving them a much better life, but that doesn't compensate for not being there for your family. And it's really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And there's no way, unless you're a trafficking victim, and maybe you could bring your kids over, but it's hard. Trafficking is it's difficult to prove things, and it's hard, and we hope no one's trafficked, and most people are just being very badly exploited, but employers know that they can do this to people, and it is worrisome. But yeah, and Duterte's daughter is still there. She's the vice.
Yeah. And she's in charge now of education.
She's in
So
charge of it.
I'm
So
wondering
this
what
is
she's going to change with
the
the history books.
disinformation campaign, the history with both her and Marcos. And it's scary when you change history. This is similar in the US now, with
Yeah.
some of those right-wing Republicans. They don't want Americans to know about their history, about exploitation. And there's, if you don't learn from the past, you're bound, I'm paraphrasing badly, but to repeat it,
Yeah, yeah. No,
And
no, no, no. I've said that. Many people I know have said that and stuff. It's just that that's why history is important and stuff.
and
So,
that, yeah.
I didn't. You don't think you don't think about how important history is until you learn until the mistakes keep reoccurring.
And social media is frightening. From what I understand, most Filipinos are on Facebook. It's one of the countries that has a lot of people on Facebook. And there's what you see on Facebook isn't really reality, and it's easy to manipulate people.
Yeah,
So and there isn't any counter narrative. There's only the, this distorted narrative that this really didn't happen.
yeah.
It's a lot like 1984 Brave New World. I mean, I feel as if, well, and here we've got The Handmaid's Tale. A lot of literature is becoming
Yeah,
reality, and it's very frightening because the truth shall set you free. You do need to know reality, because if this guy isn't different, and so far it doesn't seem he is different, then you're going to have looting because they really self-aggrandized. There's a lot of self-aggrandizement, and you're also going to have continued repression, people killed, people disappeared, people put in
yeah, yeah. I mean,
prisons
it's
for a
happening in
very
Latin
long
America
time.
too, and
It is.
stuff.
Well, there's Duterte, Bolsonaro, Modi, there's certain Trump,
Yeah,
there's certain people that are dictatorial and authoritarian, and it's happening in a lot of countries, and that's going to be the future if we're not vigilant
yeah, yeah. Well,
and we
that,
don't
yeah.
fight back.
Thank you for telling me about the call, people getting into call center. I didn't know that actually and stuff. So that might be one of my next cartoons. So I'll have to do some
Yeah.
research on that.
Yeah, there's a woman who works for one of the unions in the Philippines, and I
Yeah.
was reading something she wrote about that. And also, actually, there is a woman here. I could maybe connect you with her who did work in the. I can Let me check. Who did work in a call
Oh,
center
yeah,
there
I'd
and
love
is
that
over
because
here now.
yeah,
So
before I do a cartoon, I do research because I can't think of good ideas unless I know a subject and stuff. And so if before I do a call center cartoon, I'm probably going to need some research to learn more.
I'll have to check, but yeah, do research, because yeah, I was also surprised at what that person had written about the call centers. But yeah, I mean and oh, the other thing is there's the indigenous people too, and it seems that's a big issue in the Philippines. They're in the mining areas,
Yeah,
sadly, and so a lot of them are being displaced, and their schools are being shut down, and so
yeah,
that's a difficult situation too
yeah,
for
yeah.
but that's true everywhere in the world. Unfortunately, indigenous people are near or have land that's on resources, like here with the pipelines. But
Yeah.
and I know Canada does a lot of mining, and there's lots of countries. I saw a map of the Philippines, and you didn't even have to have the outline, because there's so many, all the natural resources that are being exploited. It's like it covers the whole outline of the country, because
Yeah,
and now, of course, with China and Taiwan,
yeah,
military bases are going in, and Philippines was able to get those bases out, or at least not no new ones, but
yeah,
yeah, at least no new bases. And now, because of the proximity to Taiwan, and also the Marcos's relationship with the US, because his father was able to go to Hawaii when
yeah,
they were expelled. There's going to be a lot more militarization. And there was that one case where that
Transgender woman,
yeah,
Ganda.
woman,
Ganda,
Ganda,
yeah,
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 exactly, was killed, and I hope there aren't more of those.
yeah. I saw a documentary
Situations.
on that and stuff. It was a very good documentary.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I just saw a documentary, and I guess this was a big thing in the Philippines. There was a woman who was working overseas, and she was accused of a crime and was hanged. I mean, hung. I mean, she was,
oh,
yeah, killed. And I guess there was a big I think it was Singapore or something, and there was a big,
oh, I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
yeah, and there was there was so much outrage in the Philippines. Concepcion, maybe,
yeah,
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 I can't remember her name, but yeah, and there were protests, and the Filipino government didn't the government in the Philippines didn't do enough
yeah,
to help her until right near the end when it was too late, and then they didn't do much either. And
yeah,
and this woman, yeah,
yeah.
really
Yeah,
suffered.
there's a lot of cases like that where in Dubai, a housekeeper was murdered, and the son of the employee, it turned out he raped and killed her and stuff. And I think in Dubai, I think it's Dubai or Kuwait, one of those countries where that happened and stuff. And a couple of migrant workers, house caregivers were found killed and stuff over the years and stuff. And they're trying to, you were talking about labor laws and protecting migrant workers. These domestic workers, you know, they took away their passport. They weren't allowed to go out at certain times.
Uh-huh.
Their lives were very controlled and stuff. I forget her name and stuff, but yeah, I just did a cartoon on that recently and stuff. But I read about it and I kept thinking, like, that's why I think your work is important and stuff. And that's why I want to thank you for all the work that you do to help protect vulnerable workers and vulnerable migrant workers in this country and stuff. I'm not sure what we can do in other countries, but at
Oh,
least here I'm thankful for you for that.
oh, I found her. It's Flor Contemplacion is
Yeah,
the woman, yeah, who was hanged on in 1995 despite a personal plea for clemency. And then we also had a woman, and she spoke actually at the county. I actually went to something that I think Powys put on, and this, maybe it wasn't Powys, but it was some sort of event. And this woman was talking about how she was only, I think she was only 15, 14, 15, 16, somewhere around there, but they put 24 on the passport. She went to one of the Middle Eastern countries, and she ended up with a father and son that were trying to rape her. And she kept, fighting back. And then the father had a knife and she struggled and he got stabbed. And you probably know that. And they were going to give her like a bunch of lashes.
yeah,
But there was a Chinese businessman who had her, and they sent her to death first, and then he had X-rays of her body, so they found out she was really just a kid, and
yeah,
so they changed it to these lashes, and she ended up with the lashes, but then she did get to go home, and there was some film made about her. And I had her speak at the county. And oh yeah, so I went up to her after, because it was Tagalog with a little English, so I kind of understood enough of it. And I said, "You're a victim of human trafficking." And she said, "No." She said, I'm just speaking up for caregivers, domestic workers." And I told her what trafficking was. And she said, "Yeah, I guess I am." And so
yeah,
she came to the county, and the coalitions sponsored her. And I mean, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. And I think they made a film in the
yeah.
Philippines about her too.
Um,
So it really tore my heart out, to hear
the
her
problem is
story.
there's too many stories like that and stuff.
There are, and it's not like the Philippines really is doing enough. They maybe have some agency they set up, but it seems like, I've heard of workers going to the consulate and saying, do you have a fund? I've been trafficked, and they don't get any response. And that's what they should really be doing, because the Mexican consulate, oh, they are so wonderful. They
Yeah.
they do so much. They do so much in the community. They fund lawyers. They fight for the people. They partner with government agents. I know the Philippine consulate does do some partnering with government agents, but nothing like the Mexican consulate. They're really there for their nationals.
That's good. That's good. So,
It is
oh,
kind of yeah, it's great. Anyway, yeah, and I want to thank you for the work you do. I think your cartoons are just so important. We don't have enough political cartoonists, and particularly the type of work you're doing in terms of exploitation in this country, abuses in the Philippines, and your artistry is so beautiful. You're so meticulous, and
well,
plus
no,
the
part of it's
topic.
due to you, and due to
Oh,
I can't do my cartoons unless I learn from an act, because a lot of the stuff that you work on, you're not going to find in a newspaper. So I have to
right.
talk to activists to learn about those issues. But there are Filipino activists in the Philippines doing that work too. I think one of the issues, like now I'm not in the newspaper anymore, and in some of those cartoonists, they freelance. And the Philippine newspapers are having a similar struggle as American newspapers are, in that there's this decline and stuff. So, but thank you for that. And so what I try to do is try to give a voice for the
You
voiceless.
do,
And
you
a lot of
really do. And that's why I admire you so much. There aren't many like you.
Ruth, thank you very much for this talk. I'm hoping that people who watch this video will learn more about issues facing the Filipino American community, and for any Filipino Americans who are watching the video, that this inspires you to get involved in the issues that you, Ruth, are working on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you.